panel discussion on science is not a special interest. I am Ani Aprahamian, and I'm faculty in the physics department here at Notre Dame. My research is in understanding energy generation and the origin of the elements in the universe. But what I'm passionate about is the energy needs of developed and emerging economies. While the topic of our panel says science is not a special interest, I'm sure many of you know that there is a huge bias in our country depending on which political persuasion you are. The AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, did a poll a couple of years ago, and the number of skeptics from the Republican Party of man-made climate change was 75%, and the Democratic Party was 35%. These are facts that we have to address as our scientists, and that's the topic of some of our panel's discussion. Particularly, what is the role of scientists as we discuss and make policy issues. I would like to start off without further delay by introducing my panelists. We have Dr. James Elser. Dr. Elser is a Notre Dame alum. He's a distinguished sustainability scientist at the Global Institute of Sustainability, and he's a Regents Professor of Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Sciences at Arizona State University. His research involves the study of energy, the balance of energy, and multiple chemical elements in living systems. He's a systems person, basically trying to understand the evolution of organization from cells to ecosystems and so on. He's done lots of field work, some of it in some very interesting areas. Yellowstone National Park, Colorado, Norway, the experimental lakes in Ontario, and so on, as well as grasslands in the Midwest here. Our next panelist, which you've heard from this morning, is Dr. Nancy Grimm. I'm going to repeat some of her introductions since many of you were not here this morning for the benefit of the students. She's a co-author of the Climate Assessment Report that is just out for comment right now and will be published soon. She's a senior sustainability scientist at the Global Institute of Sustainability at Arizona State University. She's a fellow of the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and you heard that she was a co-author of that report. Our third panelist is Professor Jessica Hellmann. She's a professor of biology here at University of Notre Dame, and she's a part of the Environmental Change Initiative on campus. Her area of study is particularly climate change and environmental effects on species and how their coping mechanisms. Dr. Hellmann is also a regular consultant for conservation of different species and conservation planning, whether it's on private or public lands. And she was part of the National Climate Assessment. She's a Leopold Leadership Fellow, which is a special brand of scientists trained to interact with the media and stakeholders. And as you'll see, I think that will be an important part of what our reaction is to climate change as a society. So without further ado, perhaps you can start, James.
Okay, thank you for an introduction. Thanks for everyone for coming. I didn't have a chance to give a real talk, so I actually made some slides, though, because it helps me communicate or organize my thoughts. So I come from outside of climate science. I'm not a climate scientist. I'm a biogeochemist, mostly study phosphorus, for example. And one reason Jessica and I have been talking about this the last couple of years as she began to organize this conference was sort of the experience it is for being outside of climate science and watching this sort of train wreck unroll over several decades of strange dialogue and weird events and science communication problems and the great conundrum we find ourselves as a society in dealing with this complex issue. And it really has been sort of horrifying to me as a scientist from outside of the field as I get closer, for example, in my phosphorus work, to working with stakeholders and policymakers in the area of food security and food production and water quality, to be terrified to walk into that arena. And I have a meeting coming up in Washington, D.C. in May where we're going to start doing this. And it's just sort of scary to think about it as a scientist to begin moving in that direction when you see what has happened in the context of climate change, because a lot of what has happened has been quite unfortunate in my mind and is symptomatic of problems we're having right now in solving our problems as a democratic society. So here's a way of thinking about it. So I'm not going to explain any of the science that's on this slide, but the conclusion up there says something like food web structure can affect the nutrient limitation of phytoplankton by changing stoichiometry of the interactors or something like that. That's my basic research. This is a paper I published a while ago. And the question that's up there is, do you believe me? Well, why not, right? Why wouldn't you, right? Because I'm the expert, right? This is my field. And if you wanted to dig further, you'd look down there. Oh, there's a citation down there. You'd look that up. That's a good journal. So you'd have confidence, right? And say, oh, yeah, sure, why not, right? Because that's my science. So I'm the expert in the area. And, why would you dispute that? And furthermore, would you ever accuse me of lying about it? Would that occur to you? That would be odd, wouldn't it? To think that someone's lying about the data they're presenting to the world in the context of a peer-reviewed scientific journal. That's kind of strange. Well, would you say that I'm lying? Or would you argue with me? Would you say that I'm lying? Would you say that I'm a part of a large conspiracy that's come together to convince people that food web structure affects nutrient cycling in lakes? Probably not, but I mean, it's sort of from that context where I sort of look at climate change and scientists who are trying to communicate the things they found out about the way the world's radiative balance works and what it's doing to the heat balance and how that relates to carbon uptake and such. And sort of strange and terrifying to realize that that we've moved into a dialogue where it seems to be commonplace for people to have this discussion about the technical findings of scientific experts on a particular field, which is not to say they might not be mistaken, those scientific experts. It's always a possibility, of course, but who is to tell me that I'm mistaken about this other than Nancy Grimm, for example, who's a world-leading biogeochemist, for example. So that's the problem. And this is what Ani referred to earlier. Would your position on that be a function of your political party? Of course not, right? That would be really weird. That your position on whether food webs affect nutrient cycling would be a function of your political party. But the first statement up there is a statement about physical nature of the universe, right? That's what scientists investigate. So why would your political party influence whether or not you have a position about a particular empirical finding? That's sort of odd. And so it's sort of a strange place that we're in right now. And it's so strange that I actually find myself debating climate science with my former Notre Dame roommates. And so here's an example of one of these exchanges. He sent me something from the National Review about something to do with climate change sensitivity, and maybe those tree huggers are overblown, et cetera, et cetera. And my reply, says, well, I think they might have some kind of selective attention about the papers in science they read at a National Review, but really, then I proposed that we form our own God Squad. That was the name of our room that the four of us lived in when we were juniors. We have our own convention, and we can talk about the albedo effect together, and we'll figure our own consensus view about climate change, or maybe not, right? Maybe we're not the right people to be doing that. Maybe we should just look to, for example, the National Academies of Sciences and let them figure it out. Just saying. Just saying. We might want to just, on this issue, ask the people in the National Academy what they think about this issue, rather than try to figure it out ourselves, because that's what normally we do about topics that are complex. That's what the National Academy of Sciences was invented to do, was to advise the government about complex issues before society that are kind of hard to deal with for technical reasons. That's what it was created for. So the thing that's given me tension over these years as it happens is I sort of thought I signed up for a program like this when I became a scientist, where our role is to figure out what's going on out there, what affects what patterns are existing or not existing, what's real, what's not real, what causes what, and then communicate that. And if it's important enough, people, will be listening, and they can decide what, if anything, they want to do about it. And it's mostly scientists who should be contributing to the left side of that process, whereas everyone has a stake in what's going on in society, participates on the right-hand side, given their values, their interests, and and that's where we adjudicate the competing interests and values in societies on the right-hand side of this process. But what's strange and weird, I think about where we are now, and it's manifested in my email discussions with my former college roommates, who's a finance major, about climate change, is that what we've gone to is something like this, where it's sort of everyone feels like they want to adjudicate about the radiative balance of the planet. And so if you have a discussion with someone about climate change, they'll say, oh, it's the sun. It's the sunspots. It's the Milankovitch cycle. Really? You're a finance major. The Milankovitch cycle? Where'd you get that from? So it's really quite amazing. So the problem is, everyone's over there on the left-hand side. It's a problem, right? The problem is that we don't get to the right-hand side very effectively, where we need to bring our values and our perspectives to bear in working out what we're going to do, or if anything we're going to do about this particular issue. So that is what I see is the problem here. And so what's at stake, there's several things at stake. I think what's at stake is not just in the context of climate change. And what's at stake here, though, is the pollution of what's the tragedy of the commons, the science communication commons. And so the dialogue, the arena where we all discuss things about, as a society, about what we're going to do and what we're not going to do, is becoming contaminated, if you will, with all kinds of discourse that seems to be out of place. And because of that, we're unable to come to the right sorts of processes. We're unable to get to the dialogue we need to have, because we're still talking about the Milankovitch cycles and whether they're contributing or not. And the history majors have an opinion about that. And so until we can get past that sort of part of the dialogue, the problem is we can't have the dialogue we need to have about the future of our planet, the future of our society, and what trade-offs we were willing to take or not take together in going there. So those are my thoughts. And I'm happy to let Nancy comment next.
Those are great thoughts. It's hard to follow Jim. It's always hard to follow Jim. You all have heard enough from me, but I'll have a few comments that maybe are in addition to that. The first of them comes from a paper that really affected me pretty strongly by Jason Neff, who is a person who studies scientists and what they're all about. And he published this in Frontiers of Ecology and the Environment. I'm an ecologist, so I was interested in this study that he published, and he was asking the question by interviewing a number of ecologists of, why do you do what you're doing? And it was the case that everyone that he interviewed felt that there were significant environmental problems and issues, and that they were motivated by concern for those significant problems. And I presented a number of these, and you all have seen them. The way that our world is changing, the sheer rate at which the global environment is changing is cause for concern. And I'm finding with a lot of students that they're very motivated by that as well. It's almost like going back to the 60s and when everyone was really motivated by these concerns. But the second thing that he asked is, okay, given that that's what motivates you and why you're doing this research, what is it you're actually trying to do? What are the visions that you have for your research? And he found that through his interviews, he was able to classify these ecologists into 4 different visions of what they were trying to do. And the first one is what I would call the sort of ivory tower vision, which is we're going to build a theory of ecosystem function. We're going to understand the way the world works. We're going to publish it, but we're not otherwise going to communicate. And the people out there that want to get that information because it's useful to use in making decisions or whatever can go and find it in the literature, or that through the scientific process we'll build on that. And I think that is it's still a prevalent view in many sciences that is the role of science, is to produce information and put it out there. in the journals that we put it out in. A second group was sort of a subset of that group. Well, not really a subset of that group, sorry. A second group was really mostly interested in management and restoration. And so that was the main reason they were doing research, was to manage ecosystems and restore ecosystems, full stop. The third group was interesting. These were people that felt that if we evaluate the ecological effects of global change and document the problems, that the evidence will be so overwhelming that it will compel change. So if we just keep doing the work and documenting what's happening and get it out there so that people understand it, communicate it, that will compel change. And then the last one is a group that wanted to sort of build a theory of human ecosystem interaction, communicating with the end users of information, so that there could be a sort of co-production of knowledge and guiding policy and so forth. Now, I mean, I found that to be quite interesting because I think when I went to graduate school, I was definitely in the ivory tower camp. But I think that the motivation of trying to sort of change the world puts me into this sort of document the effects and then something will happen. People will change. I think that's not right. I think it is not the case. And for some of the reasons that Jim was citing. So what has happened in our world is that, first of all, data and communication and the way that we interpret information, modeling, all of that sort of stuff, totally different than it was. In the 1960s, you know, probably 90% of the communications and the data and so forth were in paper or tape or some kind of archive that you could actually put your hands on and flip through. There has been a wholesale transformation of the world so that now communication, information, analysis of data is entirely in the realm of electronics. And so it's, and communication, what's important about that is that anybody can get on the web and say whatever they want. And that we have sort of a different way of thinking about what information is. So we can have these people that claim to be experts. We can have people like the folks that put out the addendum to the second National Climate Assessment that I showed in my talk, who are saying essentially, well, they're wrong. We have more, they actually said this, we cited more references, so therefore we have the upper hand here. Well, you know, that's just not sort of the way it works. So, so that was one point I wanted to make. Another one is going back to the global change, U.S. Global Change Research Program strategic plan. As I mentioned in my talk, the strategic plan now has 4 goals, of which advancing science is only one. And that is really quite a departure for this organization. In an article, it was published in Nature in 2012, Ryan Myers says that, I'm quoting here, in its 2012 report, the US GCRP has expressed a more nuanced and humble account of the role of science in society's response to climate change. For example, the draft plan provocatively states, quote, scientific knowledge is only one part of a much broader process. Information may be scientifically relevant without being decision relevant. And so, and this has to do with the sort of policy relevant questions that I was talking about earlier. So I think, you know, there has been a shift in the way that scientists are interacting with decision makers and with the public and so forth. And I think it's a good thing. But, you know, I think that there is the issue that we have to be, as scientists, aware of, which is that it's easy enough to cross that line where all of a sudden your personal convictions and your views are putting you into a position where you may actually be saying things that you may be advocating or something like that. So a question we can get in the discussion is, should we be advocating for something that we think is the right course of action? Or should we remain impartial observers or impartial honest brokers of information is the phrase that you often hear, honest brokers of information. Now, ways of knowing differ, right? So science is a way of knowing that is based on a particular process for gathering that scientific information and interpreting that scientific information and so forth. And so it's very difficult when science gets pitted against another way of knowing. And that, I think, is what's happening a lot with attitudes about climate change, is that some other way of knowing is sort of coming into play. I had one other point I wanted to make about, shoot, what was it? Sorry. It's going to come to me later, so I'm going to go ahead and pass to you. Thanks.
Okay, good. So all I need to say is, yeah, what they said, and I can be done. Yeah. All right, so I wanted to take a slightly different approach than my two colleagues, and I have a little bit of a personal perspective and some information to share with you that informs my own take on science and the role of scientists in policy making. I always say, first and foremost, I'm not a policy maker. I don't know how to make decisions. But as Jim suggested, I do know a lot about things that are relevant to decisions, and therefore I find myself increasingly willing and interested in a seat at the table, not making the decisions, but informing them. And so I have some thoughts about how scientists can play that role. And I want to put this in the context of sort of two contradictions in climate and climate science. So on the one hand, I think climate, and those of us who are sort of working on climate-related, climate impacts science, we've made really good progress in communicating about greenhouse gases and how the world is changing associated with emissions of greenhouse gases, and how the Earth's climatic processes work in a very fundamental way. But on the other hand, as Ram Ramanathan explained this morning, we've seen essentially no action in the face of decades of research that warns of dangerous consequences of human-caused climate change. So on the one hand, the public is beginning to listen to what we have to say and beginning to understand what has been said now for several decades, but still not hearing the severity of the issue. And why is this? I think it's because essentially there are sort of two main reasons. One, I think the public still does not fundamentally understand science, what science is and what it isn't. And even more so, I don't think they understand scientists. Maybe they don't have so many that are neighbors, maybe they aren't personally familiar with a lot of scientists, but I think it's presumptive to think that the average member of the public would know how scientists function. What makes science different from other ways of knowing is its method. It's a method of data analysis, of experiment, of peer review, and many other features. And what makes scientists different from other people, even when they do find themselves in some sort of advocacy position, is that scientists rely heavily on information coming from this process, and a scientist who's an honest broker should be persuadable, should be able to change one's perspective on science, given contradictory information. So we should be able to change our opinion about the prevailing view when data come in that tell us otherwise. That's what makes us scientists. So that's one thing. I think we don't understand, the public doesn't quite understand about what we as scientists are trying to accomplish. Second of all, I think a lot of responsibility falls on our shoulders. I think scientists are not doing a good enough job of communicating our scientific knowledge to a broad audience, and including when we're sharing our informed opinions about action. We spend most of our time talking to one another. As my husband says, you're very famous to an extraordinarily small group of people. And we have a hard time breaking out of our own language. I thought Jim's representation of that was great. And we have a hard time expressing ourselves to non-scientists. Partially because we've been going through decades of training to get to this point. We've kind of forgotten how to talk to people if we ever knew how to. And then we also have our own internal struggles about when and how to engage with non-scientists, and we're constantly worried about tainting ourselves by engaging with the real world. So let me share quickly some recent polling data with you. So in 2010, Scientific American and Nature magazines, granted, probably not, well, they polled readers on their websites, which is probably not, is a select group of the public, but most of the respondents to this poll were not scientists themselves, and they received 21,000 responses. And these respondents gave scientists as a general group a 4 out of 5 on a trust scale. They gave them a higher score than friends and family, which means it does better than Facebook, I suppose. And non-governmental groups, both of which received a 3 out of 5 on the trust scale. Now, when you ask these respondents about particular issues, they had a lot of variation in how much trust they had about what scientists had to say on those issues. There was quite a lot of trust about what scientists have to say about evolution, more than 4 out of 5. But things like climate change or the causes of autism or the effects of pesticides received lower scores. So again, on the one hand, scientists have quite a lot of public trust. But on the other hand, when we speak about specific issues, that trust can be eroded. But these respondents, they also thought that scientists could be involved in policy, especially European and American respondents. They said that scientists, a very small minority said that scientists should stay out of politics, and 40% said that scientists should speak out on the issues about which they are most knowledgeable. Similarly, the Pew Research just did a poll several days ago, showed that 69% of Americans agree that there is solid evidence that the average temperature of Earth is increasing, but only a third of them think that it's a very serious problem. So yet again, we're communicating our basic scientific information, but there's something about the severity of those consequences it's not getting across. So what do I think we as scientists can do about this conundrum? On the one hand, making progress, but on the other hand, still not getting through about the magnitude of this issue. And I follow very much Nancy's, in my thinking, very much Nancy's idea. This is something called the information deficit model that scientists deeply believe in and seems like it's been wholly disproven, which is this idea that if we just tell people, they will listen. The data will speak for themselves and people will be compelled to action. I think we have a much greater communication challenge before us. So I think first, scientists should be less afraid of engaging than we have been. And I think we need to find new ways of making ourselves accessible to people and to explaining ourselves, including our own individual perspectives and about the scientific approach. I believe very deeply that we need products like the National Climate Assessment because those rise above individual scientists and represent a consensus view that has weight in policy settings. But I also think that individual scientists have compelling stories to tell. I think we can do this by making ourselves available to journalists, to policymakers, and even on emerging platforms like Twitter and Facebook, #ClimateND. I think to do this, we need to each individually question our reasons for engagement and how we're going to behave when we move in this, when we have our science hat on and when we have our scientists as participating in a policy-making context. I think we do need to delineate between scientific fact and our own opinion. I personally try not to take opinions on particular courses of action because that's not my area of expertise, though I do have expertise about the need for action in general. And I think as scientists, we must try in our best to be humble, to be transparent, and to act, at least as we know it and understand it, in the public interest. Certainly in the issue of climate change, there are relatively few people who are acting in the greater public interest. And I think we should find areas of scientific inquiry where we can get traction with the public. And personally, I've been experiencing this recently in the area of climate change adaptation, where I've been moving my research, and I'm finding more common ground and more and newer ways to discuss with policymakers and the public about what climate change means, and to be able to frame the whole, to change the dialogue a little bit and talk about both what climate change means, what we might do about it, and how we're going to live with it. I think that portrays a more nuanced perspective, and another place I think scientists can contribute. So that's my take, a little bit of information and my take on how I think as individual scientists we need to be prepared to engage with the public on this really important issue.
So now I'd like to invite you to ask questions, and in the discussion in particular, there are stark differences between what's happening with climate change and what happened with the ozone hole situation a few years ago. with the US government playing the lead role in a global policy not to use the hydrofluorocarbons that were destroying the ozone. So we're in a very different place, as Dr. Elser mentioned. So please.
So I really appreciate the perspective collection that scientists go through, as far as to say, I'm a political scientist, and especially I'm a comparative political scientist, and so I think about these things a lot differently than you folks. And in a way, I kind of want to exonerate them. And I feel like, just that they're putting all this pressure on themselves, but this is the United States problem, look at Canada problem. I mean, look at Europe, where scientists and scientific information are treated much differently there. Scientific information, particularly on climate change, is not particularly partisan in Europe. And so, for me, if I hadn't heard your comments, the first thing I would think about is money in politics and what's our big problem for scientists. It's that should we be this ExxonMobil and go huge things. And I feel like scientists are very shy about calling out. But you use the phrase honest brokers of information. I think honesty is, there's a lot of science for hire out there that folks fighting against. And when it is science for hire, it should be called out as science for hire. There are people out there who are making a living as support for that person or peer-reviewed work that has very little self-interest in it, I mean, beyond your maybe your reputational state. But I feel like if all the scientists did all the good things that you're suggesting, we could still have to battle this American problem and get the money out of this debate. And the right-wing budgets are so skewed that I just wonder how.
So it's an interesting perspective on that you sometimes hear.
Like summarize.
Oh, summarize this. Yeah, that's.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do we don't have these things working?
Yeah, let's see if we can make this work.
Yeah, there's one that's working. So the summary was that contrasting, for example, Europe and the U.S., it's not partisan. Climate change is not a partisan issue in Europe, and really the root of this is that there's a lot of science for hire, where people in the United States are actually being paid to thwart the efforts of people who are actually trying to get out the information about what's really happening in terms of climate change. Is that fair enough to say? So I was just going to make a small comment and let others respond as well. But one of the things that I found really amusing, in a sort of sick way, about some of the comments about why scientists are in this. I mean, scientists are stakeholders in all of this, and we have a personal interest in. Part of the reason is what I said originally. Why do we go into this? We see there are environmental problems, and we hope that what we're doing can actually help to solve them. But there's this accusation out there that we're really in it for the money. And because we just want to get more of our grants, because actually we're just getting so rich off of those grants.
Absolutely true.
It's really pretty amusing. It's a pretty amusing accusation, because it's so completely far from the truth. But I take your point, and I think that part of it is the money. Part of it is also the sort of who do you choose to associate with. It's less being driven by facts and more being driven by, this group, the group that I want to belong to, says that this is what we should believe.
This is Professor Deborah Javelin, who's also giving a talk about the politics of climate change and climate change adaptation on Thursday at 4 o'clock. Deborah, I think what you're asking, I don't think that, so even when we say scientists, we should be clear about on whose behalf are we acting, where are our sources of funding. When I say scientists, I'm thinking of researchers who take their money from government or other resources who are obligated to be finding things in the public interest. But I don't think what you're asking, someone to call out and to say that's good quality science, that's not quality science, this is what the role, this is the politics and the nature of money in this political debate. I'm not sure that scientists are the ones who should be doing that or should be responsible for doing that. I think that's actually where some other stakeholder in this conversation needs to step up and say, science is valuable. These are the people that we trust, and this is what these people are charged with doing, much as Jim described the National Academy's responsibility. And I think it would be handy if in this country there was someone who was more willing to do that.
Well, I mean, don't you agree that with the cigarette smoking, there were lots of bot scientists, but other scientists did comment on that? Yeah. So, I mean, I think it was effective in that particular situation. So let me call on this gentleman here, then you. Okay, 3.
We didn't get
Right behind you.
Microphones have disappeared, so please speak out loud.
Okay, I'll try to speak
Where
so
did they?
people can hear. Just three very quick comments to the panel to react to. We came right up to it at the end of that discussion, but many of you have probably seen Naomi Oreskes' book, Merchants of Doubt, in which it's a pretty explicit campaign to, in fact, throw doubt onto the science, because if you have the debate about science, you don't have to talk about policy. So just the panelist reaction to that. Second, I gave a talk at Sandia National Lab on climate change, full of nuclear physicists. So, PhDs, as much science, hardcore physical science training as you're going to get. Gave the talk, very nice, light applause, da-da-da. 70% of the people didn't believe the thing I said. So this gets into the Yale part about ideology versus STEM, and just your reaction to what is that balance. And third, I don't work for these guys, but Columbia Center for Research on Environmental Decisions. It's got a really nice booklet on psychology of climate change communication. It's pretty good, and if people are interested in it, I recommend it. Thanks.
I was just going to react to saying I think it's just an interesting thing that there's a whole discipline called the psychology of climate change communication that has to be invented. And it's a sign that we haven't been effective societally in sort of bringing people to the level about where it sort of comes back to understanding what science is and how it proceeds, right? So it's science as an institution and the process of science and the self-reflection and self-checking. Science isn't perfect, but it's sort of the best way we have to sort of try to keep people honest and checking each other and don't go further than your data allow and all this sort of very cautious thing that scientists are very, in this ridiculously amazing process that Nancy Grimm, you endured this who would go through that process just to fake someone out? It would seem to be a remarkable thing. So the idea of how we could elevate understanding of how scientists work their way to these products where they get, well, we're going to screw our nerve up, we're going to say something right now as a National Academy or as some other scientific enterprise and say this. It takes a long time to get there. And the fact that kind of communication doesn't count very much, or counts just as much as some other sort of manufactured report in the same font, and will carry the day politically is quite interesting. And that someone out there, someone in another institution besides science, I think probably has to be the one who adjudicates that, who calls foul when people make that kind of argument. And I'm not sure who that is, because we're in this new media age and post-truth era and all this other thing that's going on in society. Now, I don't know how we get to that point, but as I said, it's just kind of scary to be a world to try to operate in as a scientist.
Yeah, I think we also, as scientists or as scientific entities, we need to think about ways of communicating in this novel environment where you can live in these different universes, right? So Twitter is a beautiful example of this. Everyone I know thinks the same way that I do because all the people that I'm listening to think that. And we need to find ways for science to rise above that and to be able to have a discourse with all kinds of stakeholders. I don't think we figured that out. That's partly psychology, but I think it's also something about communication that we need to improve upon. Now, as scientists, we were never taught how to do that kind of thing. We know lots about statistics, not so much about talking to real people.
Hi. I want to proffer another possible explanation for the fact that there's all the scientific information about climate change around. Oh, a little louder. I want to proffer another possible explanation for why there's all this information about climate change out there, but yet people aren't getting it, or something like the public or policymakers. And that's the idea that maybe we're not linking the environmental issues to the social, political, and cultural and economic issues as much as they need to be. That it's harder for people to connect with the larger big picture of science and climate change when they don't really see in their daily lives. They see it sort of in their daily lives, acid rain, you know, other different accidents and things that happen, and there's a side, but they don't see it in their daily lives as much as we see it through our research and all the things we do. And yet, the environmental impacts are having major impacts on economics, on culture, on social phenomena and social relations. And when those start to happen, then people really can see that it's impacting their lives in a more direct way. So I'm wondering if we're at fault a little bit for not connecting what's happening in our environment and global warming to the economic and social and political aspects of it and the fallout from that and how it's affecting our institutions and our economy. And maybe that would be a way to persuade people more.
David, you should introduce yourself.
David Bacon. I'm sociology and co-director of ISENSA on network science.
I think you're right on there. I think that's absolutely true, that we need to connect not only with the economic impacts, but also the real, cost to human well-being. We need to understand equity impacts of climate change, how different populations are affected differentially, and we need to make that information available. This is one of the reasons why the National Climate Assessment decided to use the regional approach. If you can flip through a booklet on climate change impacts and find your region, you're going to be more immediately interested because it's the place that you can identify with. It's also the reason why there was so much more talk of climate change right after Sandy. There is not a climate scientist that would stand up and say Sandy was caused by global warming. But we can say that storms like Sandy are the kind of thing that we would expect to see more frequently in the future. And so if somebody that's not a scientist, wants to go ahead and say it was caused by climate change, that's what happened. People became interested because it was something that they could see affecting them right where they live and right in their home. So there are certain things I think we could probably do in our research, just as scientists, is to always ask the question, so why do we care about this? Mm-hmm. What is it that, why do we care about what we're working on? I think Jessica had some great points about finding new ways to communicate. Just, it could be various web-based things, because the whole communication, data, everything has changed so much in the last 40, 50 years. We need to think about new ways to use that to our advantage so that we can actually, not so that it's, we're left behind as, a new truth is taking over the internet, but rather we're using that way of communication to actually promote the ideas of science and get people to understand a scientific way of knowing something.
My name is Dan Hicks. I'm a philosopher of science and a postdoc in the philosophy department here. So to some extent, what I will say is coming out of sort of my disciplinary identity and some concerns I have about the fact that my disciplinary identity isn't being represented in this panel today. So I'm hearing a lot of assumptions being made, both from the panelists and from some of the other from some of the folks in the audience who have asked questions and made comments. Things about, for example, a strong distinction between facts and ideology, or between facts and values, or assumptions about the role of experts in a democracy and the relationship between experts and the broader public. And my concern, again, as a philosopher of science, someone who knows a lot about the social and cultural history of science and the sociology of science, is that these are assumptions that my discipline rejected 30 years ago. And I'm very concerned that we have a panel that doesn't represent what I see as the expertise that folks from my discipline can bring to bear.
Well, you should come back tomorrow, actually. That's the whole discussion all day tomorrow. I'm sorry, did you finish? Okay, thank you.
I'll just apologize and say that I received my philosophy training here at Notre Dame 30 years ago.
So Susie next, and then.
Okay, good, this one works. So, hi, Susie Darling, undergraduate at Christopher Newport University in physics and psychology, and I just thought I'd comment on Jessica's talk about the scientists' kind of social ineptitude, I suppose, with communicating with non-scientifically based people. And I just wanted to add that in my experience, at my school at least, and through Facebook and social media, I'm seeing more acceptance of scientifically tuned minds, I guess. I'm seeing more things like, science is made as something like, oh, look, science is doing really cool stuff. You should like our page on science. And I'm seeing a lot more just in social attitudes in the science departments at my schools. We're having scientifically based get-togethers, and it's not just scientists anymore. We invite different people from all different departments to come and check it out, and they serve pizza, so it's pretty popular. And so I just thought I'd say, I think, at least maybe for coming generations, the inability to speak with non-scientists might not be as big of a clash as maybe it currently is, because I'm friends with a lot of different, non-scientific people, and I seem to be getting good at communicating with them to, this is a science thing, and this is how it affects you, kind of. I just thought I'd put that out there.
It's great to hear that science is not just for nerds anymore.
Well,
Speak for yourself, Nancy.
I think it's more of a nerds are becoming more accepted in society, and it's not so much
Revenge
like
of the nerds.
if you're if you're a nerd, you're immediately placed outside. It's more like, oh, you're the nerd of our group now. You're not just that nerd over there sitting in the corner. Come over, have
Group
pizza.
needs at least one nerd.
Yeah, and I think this part of this, I mean, science is, it's easy to sort of talk about science in this ivory tower sense and that we're the experts and we know. I don't think that we think that. I don't think that. I think that science is part of a democratic process. I think it's a particular way of knowing. I think we need to make people understand what it is about and why is it a way of knowing. So the more that scientists are not sort of isolated and that are seen as, and the scientific process is actually participatory, but in an informed participatory way, not in a manipulating kind of way, I think would be a great progress. And you're leading the way, Susie.
My name is Merv Kusnirik. I'm a retired certified public accountant and chief financial officer. And I agree with Jim that us finance majors should not be commenting on climatology, but maybe we do have something to offer. And that is to say that within our field of work, we have a thing called generally accepted accounting principles, generally accepted accounting standards that have to be applied throughout the industry, throughout whatever financial report is legally put together, so as to eliminate the confusion that stems from not just scientists versus non-scientists, but within the scientific community itself. Why can't we have a generally accepted policy board that says, right or wrong, these are the principles that we will be adhering to from this point forward, unless somewhere down the road they get changed? I think if you had something standard, the general public could more easily buy onto it.
So a standardized approach for applying some level of epistemological correctness on a finding or
let's say on the subject of climatology, is it right or is it wrong? Is what is being said correct or incorrect? Whether it's be the national board that you referred to,
So my understanding is this is the role of these sort of commissions, like the National Academy of Sciences, to operate in, to provide that kind of stamp of approval.
But does it have the meat, the hook behind it, to make, let's say, government and all related industries follow through on that? And that's where the difference, I think, is with generally accepted accounting principles. It's a regulated industry, so that any report that's filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission, for example, has to be in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles.
Yeah, you're right. Science is sort of a free-for-all. Yeah.
Well, I think that, partly in response to that, it would be very hard to have a sort of set of standard, these things are right and these things are wrong, because it's also a continually changing and evolving system of knowledge. I mean, we have, the current state of knowledge is not going to, it's going to be quite different 5 years from now. There'll be a lot of new things that we know that we didn't know today. So that's one problem with a sort of rigid set of standards. Another one is that the scientific community is self-policing in a sense. I mean, we have peer review as that is the prime standard for evaluating whether the quality of a piece of scientific work. It's review by the peers and publication or acceptance of a grant proposal or something like that.
I'm not suggesting that any statement has to be permanent, any more so than a generally accepted accounting principle is standard forever. It changes, but until it changes, at least you've got everybody walking in the same direction.
Interesting idea.
Good afternoon. Alex De Silva, Calumet College of St. Joseph, and I'd like to thank everyone for putting on such a great conference and a wonderful panel. Thank you very much for bringing up Dan Kahan. I think one of the beautiful things that Dan really brings to the table is that as scientists, we only communicate one way. And if you get a chance to read Kahan's work, what you'll find out is that there are actually 4 subtypes or subcategories in which we all fall into. And so what I would challenge the group to consider is that it's not creating one message, just like, I don't want to pick on the young lady who said, well, it's kind of cool that she's like the science person among non-scientists, but there's something that is shared by that group, even though she is the science person in that group. But that instead of looking at just communicating climate change as one message, there really needs to be 4 messages. And that's really the only way that we'll be able to get people to stop really looking at how do we attack scientists and move on to the issues. But I know that's really difficult to consider. But is it even possible to develop 4 messages around one idea as it relates to climate change?
Can you tell us the 4? I mean, is this a...
Off the top of my head, I can't remember the 4 hierarchies. I know that one is a hierarchist, the other one is a utilitarian. Hierarchist, utilitarian.
Yeah, they're personality dimensions.
Yeah, they're the 4. Yeah, there's a grid of 4 personality dimensions.
It speaks to how they hear the message when you give them the same message.
Correct, and actually that goes back to
receptive
who
they
do you trust?
Yeah.
Because if you look at, if you have this survey, the poll that you just said, well, we highly value scientists. We give them 4 out of 5. But on certain issues, they are not the people that we really highly value. That is because the people who have captured that group is in another quadrant, and that's the quadrant that they rely on. So I think if the message really, if we were to really think about climate change using Kahan's sort of framework, and actually Kahan's framework is not new because it really goes back to Wildalski at Berkeley. And the paper was, I think, 72 or something like that, but can't remember the exact citation here. But it is that quadrant framework, and I really think that would probably be the only way that this group can move forward, is to really break this message up into 4 distinct messages to motivate each people in their own quadrant to take change.
Just a question, that's not, the quadrants that you're talking about are not like the Stokes quadrants?
No, they're not the Stokes quadrants.
Different,
yeah.
okay. Thank you. It seems like this is a very similar to the gentleman here who was saying, can you put the message in this other term that would be relatable for our economy, or would be related? Yeah. Multiple ways, yes, I agree.
Hi, my name is Libby Johnson. I am an undergrad at Taylor University in environmental science and biology. I thank you so much for this panel. It's been really informative and interesting. I have a question about, we were talking a little bit about the effects of social media and kind of people from other disciplines forming their own ideas. And I just thought of what it would be like to have my photo major roommate get in a debate with me about climate change. And I feel like, though, there's some credit to that, the whole idea of the liberal arts being interdisciplinary. How do you feel the other disciplines can contribute to our discipline in general?
Well, I'll take that on. I think they absolutely have to be there. Climate change is not something that is reserved for climate scientists or ecologists if we care about ecological effects, or transportation scientists if they care about what happens to the transportation systems, or engineers. It's something that involves all of us, and so the kind of different ways that we can, and the decisions that have to be made are not something that we can just sort of hand down and say these are the decisions that have to be made. I think our message, if we do agree on anything, it's that we need to be at the table, because we need to bring the knowledge that we have, as imperfect as it may be, to helping to make those decisions, but it's not our role to make the decisions. So, your photography major roommate may have some really, really important messages for, communicating climate change impacts through visual means that can have a much bigger impact than a chart that I put up on the screen or something like that. But ultimately it's going to affect all of us. So I think that we all have to be involved in the discussion.
And one other quick thing, do you feel that with the availability of information in this day and age, do you feel like it's okay for just people who aren't in the discipline to have informed opinions about it?
The catchword is informed, I think.
Yeah, so the question is, where is the information coming from? Yeah, so there's no shortage of stuff.
That's the problem. Sometimes
Yeah.
it comes from invalid sources.
So it becomes a very difficult battle, right? You just Google on climate change, and it's horrible. You just go out there and you just get mired in these endless loops of weird discussion, and it's just, every time I do it, because I teach a little climate change thing in my intro biology course, go through it, and I just Google around and see what's going on, and every time I come out, it's sort of, I have to sit down for a second and wash my hands and and say, wow, that is weird out there. Think how the people are what they're talking about climate change out there is very strange, and it's sort of like, yeah, but if you just go to National Academy site, it's pretty clean, good place to go for information. So that's where I usually end up, is that's what I show. So it's information literacy, this is really more important now than ever, is how people sort information, and it's going to be an important skill, obviously.
Thank you.
I'm wow, too close to the mic. Nick Bonneau. I'm a grad student here in the history department. I do history of science, and I guess I sort of have a question similar to that of my colleague here, Dan. It seems like with technological and market forces being what they are, journalism has kind of fallen into a place of not really informing the public, or perhaps informing too much of the public. And I'm not going to get into that now, but we seem to be at a point where all the Upton Sinclairs and Rachel Carsons have websites and blogs rather than are publishing and putting their lives and their tragic struggles on page. And I'm wondering, as a historian, who I don't know why I keep getting invited to this thing as a historian, because we're very uncomfortable with the future, as you might have picked up.
It's hard to predict.
But yeah, so, but there are interesting areas being brought up in HBS, STS, that are, I think, of value here. There's a word that's been kicking around for a while, agnotology. I think that came up a little bit with our Merchant of Doubt friend, the idea of how patterns of ignorance, whether these are produced intentionally or not intentionally, how those affect policy. We've got basically a phenomenon that's been out here for about 20 or 30 years, if not more, depending on how you look at it. And we certainly have a plethora of 20th century historians looking for funding to get into something with some teeth. And it would seem like these would be good people to sit at the table, again, as Dr. Hellmann said, not necessarily being part of the conversation, but perhaps informing the conversation. Because as a historian, it strikes me that this conversation is in a dangerously ahistorical context. These problems that we have are very they go right back to germ theory. They go right back to public health in the late 19th century. We're dealing with the idea of like what are our liberal rights versus what is the public good, and this is a conversation that's been had for 150, if not more, years. How do we place ourselves? Is there a fear of placing ourselves within that historical context, and that we may be susceptible to the squishy and uncomfortable dimensions of a historic argument, placing ourselves in an historic argument? Or should we historians hide for the hills and just simply observe what you guys do, write it down, and talk to our grandkids?
It would be good to have your help, I think. I feel it's sort of like Groundhog Day with climate change, because it goes way back to LBJ. I mean, the first presidential reports on the dangers of climate change were issued 40, 50 years ago. And with the same language, with the same everything. Yeah, so it's very, again, I'm not in the field. It's just sort of watching it happen. It's just strange. It's like, God, so maybe someone can help us, hit the reset button on the DVR or something and spin this next iteration on climate change in a different direction. We have to figure out a way that's different than, because every George Bush, all of them down the line, Jimmy Carter, they all have these reports come out. So we're going to have a new one, and then what, right? So what will happen that's different this time?
Yeah, and I just enjoy reminding my students that it was under the Nixon administration that the Clean Water Act came out, and
Absolutely,
so
the best.
nice little victory there.
Most environmental president. But I think it's really important to have that historical perspective, because first of all, there are these things called legacies that we, at least in ecological systems, are starting to understand what. For instance, past land use is a very large determinant of the kinds of things that we're seeing today. And so at least in terms of responses to climate change, it's really important to understand the context, which includes the historical context, in order to understand what's going on. And so I think the historical perspective is hugely valuable, and no, you should not go hide and watch what we do. You should be participating and involved in it.
Yeah, Nick, in just crafting this panel, we kind of had this idea that this is Science Day. So we'd have scientists up here sort of sharing our perspective and our struggle with it. But I don't think we have the answer. So I would like for you to tell us what to do.
Yeah.
We know we don't have the answer. In fact, yes. I think it's one thing we do agree on. I've been convinced a long time that climate change is not about the data. It's not about making a prettier graph or figuring out how to make a better joke while you're talking or any of these things. It's not about the data. It's really about something very, very different. And as scientists, we don't know how to go about that. So there's all these disciplines that are being invented to figure out how that works. And I think as scientists, this is frustrating. I think mostly we would like to be listened to in that we think we have data that are really important for the future of our society. We might be wrong, but most of us think that we're right about it, and that who are the specialists in that area. And it would really be good to be listened to so we can have the dialogue that's needed, that takes into account everyone's values and politics and ideologies and everything else that has to compete in a democracy. Right? But again, that's what I was trying to say with my slides. I don't feel like we're having that conversation as a society yet. We're still having a conversation about something else. And I can't say I put my finger on it.
I want to make one more comment or two more comments about history. Sorry. I think that there's two aspects of that. I think if we have the historical perspective on how and I think you were couching it this way, how society has responded to past crises like this, and learning from that, I think that the richness that's available there for how we should support decision makers and so forth, and the kinds of decisions we need to make, we can look to what has been done in the past as a really important example of how we can do that. But the other one is a more scientific thing, which is that, as we move into kind of a new era, when there's a new normal, there are certain parts of science where we use the past to kind of predict the future. So we take what has happened in the past and think about that as the range of possibilities, and then model what we might expect to see in the future on that basis. And the real challenge there is that we have to be really careful about doing that, because we may in fact be crossing certain thresholds that would put us into a new kind of domain of stability where we're not able to predict what's going to happen on a 3 degrees C warmer world, that there may be some thresholds that are crossed that using the past information will not allow us to predict what's going to happen in the future. So there's that's just sort of a little caveat on that, on caution, using caution to think that history always repeats itself. And yeah, you don't believe yeah.
So we have 4 people standing up and some others with questions in the audience and 3 minutes left. So the ladies that
I
are
will be
standing
very
up, do you
quick.
want to do it fast?
My name is Melinda Gormley. I'm with the John J. Riley Center for Science, Technology, and Values. I am a historian of science. I have taught on science advocacy and science advisors, and that's what my writing's on. So if you are following hashtag #NDClimate, I've already put up a couple different things that I would suggest in terms of a bibliography, including Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's Merchants of Doubt. I also would suggest to go on Jessica's point about communication, Nancy Barron's Escape from the Ivory Tower. I would also recommend the AAAS Science and Advocacy pamphlet that came out, which was based on a October 2011 conference, and then the pamphlet came out in May of 2012. That has some really good advice about what to do if you want to talk on these issues but not go over the line into advocacy. And then I would also suggest Roger Pilkey Jr.'s Honest Broker for really understanding what we're talking about the different roles that people take on, as well as how both science and values operate in policymaking.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Susan Ask, and I want to go back to the idea of audiences because I'm a lapsed scientist. I've been an extension agent for 6 years, so my job now is to go out and talk with people about science. And there are many different audiences, which I find makes this a much easier proposition. Another Yale project is on climate communications in the Six Americas study. Only 8% of the American public are dismissive of climate change, but they are very, very loud, and so they grab a disproportionate share of attention.
They're in my email stream.
And they instill fear. I was happy at the last workshop I did that teachers told me they finally weren't afraid to talk about climate change in their classes. I'm not sure exactly why that is, but it's a very small group, and as my colleague Alejandro Grajal, is he in here? I'm going to borrow his line. 8% is also the number of people in the United States who think Elvis is alive. So putting it in that context really helps. And identifying, knowing your audience is really important. And I know when I talk, I do trainings for teachers so they can teach climate change. I talk with garden clubs, I talk with business owners. I've never been attacked on the science of climate change. There are a vast majority of people who are interested.
Great.
And to think about in terms of messaging, they're a bit overwhelmed and they don't know what to do. They want to do something meaningful. They want to do something. They don't really want to call their senators, but they want to do something and they want something done. So knowing the audience is a way to make the communications much more possible. We had a great discussion about this over lunch, and I think that's a really important point that I can attest to from stopping research and going out and talking with.
I would just follow up that because it's interesting. The agricultural extension legacy, right, is a way of actively transmitting modern knowledge to practitioners, right? And at ASU actually now they have sustainability practitioners extension. They have a sustainability extension office which is designed to actively work in the community to bring sustainability solutions on various issues into city governments or companies or what have you. So sort of this extension office idea, which was so successful in the history of agriculture in the United States, could be a way that a new institution that needs to be formed.
And does a lot with
Sea
that.
Grant, that's right. Sea Grant is
because
another
it's
good
through NOAA,
example.
But it's a back and forth. It's
Yeah,
not
that's
a
right.
scientist to the broad public. It's a back and forth between people with
Needs,
expertise
right.
as farmers or gardeners or teachers or whatever it is, and people with expertise in climate science or adaptation and mitigation. So it's two-way communication.
It's a great model, I think.
Okay, I feel bad to cancel the people standing up, but let's make it fast.
Okay, I'm Peggy McGrath, and I consider myself a layperson here. I'm from Oak Park, Illinois, and when you're talking about how do we become informed, I also read Merchants of Doubt, which talks about the media did not say that this is truth and this isn't. They gave them both the same equal time. I don't know what happens with social media. It concerns me that scientists would get on social media because everybody says everybody can get on social media. So how do we find the sources? Like I'm learning today, good sources. How do the lay people find the sources, and how do you get it out to us? Thank you.
I think that's, again, another issue of science education, so we'd spend more time raising awareness about where sources of quality information are. Places like the National Academy, the AAAS, are really great places to find reliable information that's passed through peer review. I know, yeah, so it's so sort of, and I think about it when I do my own teaching. I try to teach a lot about the process of science, and I really focus on scientific reasoning in students. What I seem to be neglecting, and I need to fix, is I don't spend a lot of time talking about the institutions of science, sort of how it is that science operates as a practice, as a community. Because I really focus more on the students' reasoning abilities is what I'm interested in, understanding what science is. But what science is beyond how an individual does it. It's a social process that it exists in a societal context, and there are these institutions that impose different structures and processes to assure or increase the reliability of things that come out of that process. And so, but I don't do enough teaching of that myself.
But I think also with the National Climate Assessment, the NCA net is intended to be a place where both groups are outside of government as well as individuals can become part of that partnership or that network. So there are a number of groups who have joined that NCA net that are, just organizations within state or local jurisdictions that are interested in participating.
Okay, one last question.
Yeah, I'm Laura Walls. I teach in the English department here, and I teach in literature and science. I'll try to reduce what I had to say to a small compass, which is that I can think of three case studies where scientists and non-scientists have worked together or tried to at the interface between science and the public, and I think they're instructive. The first one was an NEH panel that I served on to devise educational opportunities, and the top choice of our panelists was a climate change panel proposal or educational proposal. We rated it the highest of any of the 150 odd proposals we received, but the program officer told us in final selection that it was off the table because it was too political. So there's an opportunity. This is NEH. This was in November of about a year and a half ago, November. If NEH is steering humanists like me away from developing institutional programs, both locally and nationally, then that's really bad news. Some good news. When I was living in South Carolina, you did not mention the words climate change aloud. One of the places of ridicule was the local weather station. A local weatherman in Columbia, South Carolina, by the name of Jim Gandy, decided that this was wrong. He somehow got the word talking to climate people and that he needed to help educate the public. So he did a total about-face, and he's now become an agent of change in Columbia, South Carolina, which is pretty stunning. And so there you have an interface point, which is the local weather, which is where a lot of people, a lot of the public gets their information about how to link up what they're experiencing in their felt world with the science. And there needs to be more attention to that front. The third case is, I think, a good example. A local museum that I work with in Concord, Massachusetts has combined scientists together with myself and some other humanists. We're about to open an exhibit for the public called Early Spring, Henry David Thoreau and Climate Change, which goes back to the history of the question, back as far as the 1850s. This has had good press, good support. We didn't go to NEH for our money. These are 3 examples of places that are practical, public, where scientists and humanists and artists need to work together. Thanks.
Thank you. I think we should not make any comments. Let's thank the panelists. And,